Welcome to Double Vision Podcast. We're identical twin sisters who grew up with retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative eye condition. I'm Jenelle, born 4 minutes earlier, so naturally I get to go first. And I also work as a therapist, so I'm drawn to stories of healing and resilience.
And I'm Joy. I work in the field of education, and I'm also a writer. I like to bring a creative lens to how we talk about blindness.
Though we look alike, we've often seen this disease and life through very different lenses.
That's why we created Double Vision Blog, to share our stories, our struggles, and our laughter.
Which is now morphing into a podcast.
To remind us that there's no single right way to navigate blindness.
On this podcast, we focus on the social and emotional impacts of losing vision.
The parts of the journey that don't show up on the eye charts.
Welcome back to Double Vision Podcast. This is Jenelle, and today we are going to be continuing our discussion on belonging by digging into the topic of identity. And Joy's going to tell you a little bit more about what we have in store for you.
Yeah, so we are going to discuss how our identity kind of forms. Oftentimes it is because of basically people's responses to how we act and how we show up as pieces of our identity. And so we thought we would dig into some of our earliest memories of when we realized that vision loss was part of our identity. And we're going to take you on a little bit of a journey today in hopes that you can dig into maybe pieces of your own identity that you've maybe tried to protect or not show the world in the past, whether you have vision loss or not, and what that might mean about you and your identity and how you show up in the world.
So Joy, let's rewind time and have you tell us a little bit about what you remember about Big Bird. We're going all the way back to Big Bird.
All right. So I have this early memory, so it was probably around the age of 5, of being in a doctor's office and being asked to follow this Big Bird figurine that I think it must have been an optometrist or an ophthalmologist was having me follow. And he said, don't move your head, just your eyes. And I remember I would see Big Bird and then Big Bird would disappear. And you know how when you're little, you don't really have a lot of, there's like not a lot of language, but you can remember feelings. I think that sometimes we underestimate even how much children can pick up on things, even if they don't understand the language going on, that they pick up a lot on feelings, and probably depending on the child, right? I think I was a pretty sensitive child. And so I remember the feeling being there's something wrong here and not a good feeling, and people being quiet and maybe me not performing how I was supposed to. I was supposed to maybe be seeing Big Bird more than I was seeing him.
Yeah, and this is so interesting to me. This is Jenelle. We're the same, right? We are identical twin sisters, and I have no recollection of this memory at all. So I think this is just a good example of how we can be raised in the same households, have the same biology, and even form memories differently as individuals.
That's a good point. Yeah, because you were there. You were right next to me. I remember.
Well, I have different memories, like early memories about vision loss. This is Jenelle. I have this early memory from first grade, actually, and this is the first time that I can recall that I remember feeling like I was doing something wrong because my eyes worked differently than other people. So for the most part, I could see well in my central vision and I could read small print. I didn't appear from anyone looking from the outside. I didn't use any special tools at that time, adaptive skills, anything. I did have that diagnosis that my teachers were aware because it was in my IEP that I had a visual impairment. And beyond that, though, my classmates didn't know. I was really unaware of really what my disability was. I was just like, this is just how I see the world. So that's what I recall. And so I just have this memory of being asked to go up to the chalkboard to write something down. And when I got up there, because the chalk kind of blended into where it was sitting below, I just instinctively started to feel around for the chalk instead of looking down to look for it. And I think that's just the way my body worked with having a lack of peripheral vision. And then I heard this really stern voice behind me, my teacher's voice, saying, use your eyes. And I was really startled by it. and felt really ashamed. And that's like one of my earliest memories of feeling shame about my
Mm.
vision loss. And I don't share that to say, like, oh, she was a bad teacher or blame anyone. That's not the point of digging into any of these stories. Really, it's just a way of understanding, like, I wonder what about seeing me access the world in the way I was doing it, seeing me feel around was so upsetting to her. I wonder what was so upsetting about having a student who was not acting like the other students.
Well, I hope she's listening now and feels terrible. No, I'm just kidding. This is Joy. um, I'm wondering though, I mean, I remember hearing about this teacher a bit, and this didn't seem like an isolated, like not the way she just treated you. This was probably something that she did that was common to other kids too, right? But not just in different forms.
Well, she wanted things a certain way. So I remember if a student would read in a robotic voice, she would say, "Stop reading like a robot. That is not how we read in first grade." So she had learned methods or intertwined them with her personality. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But that's just, yeah, that was just kind of how she went. But it did have an impact on me. And that is my first indication. That was my first indication of a young person of like, ooh, you don't want to let people see you doing something a different way. And interestingly enough, when we look back at these memories, you have something kind of similar that you recall.
Yeah. So I remember a little bit at school, like in kindergarten, I remember if there was a teacher's assistant or something that we would be pointed to, and that, she would say, "Oh, we're leaving Joy and Janelle's drawings up on the board a little longer for a certain reason." So I remember, it's weird that I would remember things like that. And I think you remember that too. But then at home, I do have this distinct memory of trying to find, it was probably paper or a pencil or something on the counter. And again, kind of like you with the chalkboard, instinctually feeling around. And I also had just been taught like this sweeping method. I don't remember what they called it, some non-visual sweeping technique by my vision itinerant at school. She like dumped a bunch of beans on the floor and had me kind of use this light sweeping motion to try to locate them. And so I was doing the same thing I had just been taught at home. And then I remember my dad saying, "Stop feeling around like Helen Keller." And he like turned up the lights brighter, like you should. And I'm going to say this now and frame it, and that I had a conversation with my dad about this and asked his permission to share this story, because again, like just like we don't want to shame the first grade story, the first grade teacher, we don't share these stories to have a bad guy in the story. Obviously, we've all said things as parents that we're not really present or aware. And when I did discuss this with my dad, he was like, I was a different person then, and I'm slower to speak these days. He's like, and I really respect Helen Keller, and she did amazing things. The fact that I would use her, negatively and tell you not to do something, just shows where I was at that time. And I think that there was and still is a lot of fear about vision loss. So I think in his mind, he was probably afraid of, oh my gosh,
Mm-hmm.
is my daughter going to look blind, or is she going blind? Just the fear that he was ingrained with. This isn't a dad issue. This was a cultural something, that over time and history was definitely passed down to him as well.
This is Janelle. I'm thinking of this famous quote that many of us are familiar from Maya Angelou, like, when we know better, we do better.
Mm.
And we continue to learn and to grow. And so, yeah, it's not about this terrible cancel culture that has become part of our society. It's about exploring our stories as a way to understand, like, where is this coming from? Why do we have this fear? And how does it get wrapped into our identity in ways that can be really harmful? And so I'm curious, Joy, like, do you have any thoughts about where this fear comes from, or any knowledge of like what the history of that would be?
Well, I think first, I mean, of course, there's the books we've discussed before, such as The Country of the Blind by Andrew Leland. There's also Their Plant Eyes that really digs into the history and culture of blindness. But I think the bigger discussion on belonging and identity dates way back to probably the years of hunters and gatherers, where basically your survival did depend on how others saw you and you fitting in and belonging with the group. And so just like people used to scan the horizon for predators such as mountain lions, they would scan for, am I accepted in this group? Because if you're not, then basically, if you were a loner way back in the day, you were dead. And so I think that's in our nervous systems and DNA still, even though it doesn't make sense now. People say, oh, don't worry about what other, it's none of your business what people think of you, and all of those sayings that, yes, and to some degree that's true. And there's all the sayings about overthinking and not worrying too much about what people think. And yet, those are all really real fears still in our nervous system based on our history. And so I don't think they come out of nowhere. I think it's something that, being an educator, I'm always looking at, like, where did this come historically, and what can we learn and dig into from each of these places where we've been as humans.
That's so interesting, Joy, what you're saying about the history of why we have that fear when it comes to belonging and identity. And I also think there are reasons that exist in the present that we need to be aware of connection, because social connection is such a big piece. And so while we don't need to be worried about getting kicked out of a small group of hunters and gatherers, we do need to be aware of how important social connection is just for our well-being as humans. And so that makes sense to me that many of us are very aware of the aspects of our identity that are acceptable, and maybe some of the ones that are seen as less than or othering. And I know we've explored some of those stories and experiences in the past on this podcast.
Yeah, I'm wondering, as you grew up then, I mean, obviously you had that experience, Jenelle, with your teacher in first grade. Was it at that point that you were like, okay, I'm not going to, like, how did you act differently, or what lengths did you go to kind of hide that part of your identity?
Yeah, I wasn't conscious of it at all. I just think as I continued through school, I saw around me students who were disabled or had anything about them, whether it would be different parts of their identity related to race or religion or their appearance, could be excluded for a lot of reasons. Turns out we find a lot of reasons to exclude people in our culture, and we even do that medically too. So it's so interesting being in the healthcare field now. I mean, I work in a profession as a mental health clinician where we listed homosexuality as a mental illness for many years in the DSM, which we use to diagnose, and that has been changed over time. But what we understand to be acceptable as a culture shifts over time. So it's just really fascinating as a disabled person to notice how identity related to disability is still oftentimes seen as less than, or something to be pitied, or something that evokes a sense of othering.
That's a really good point. And it's interesting too that you bring up the medical aspect, because I do think that has something to do with why I also experienced the Big Bird story, that my very first memories associated with that piece of my identity was within a medical office. And where do you go when you're sick, or when you need medicine and there's something wrong with you? You go to the doctor's office, right? So even being in a doctor's office was telling me there's something wrong, it needs to be fixed. And of course, in the case of retinitis pigmentosa, there is currently no widely used cure. And so I think that's also something that's worth noting when you're digging into vision loss as part of your identity, that largely as a society, we look at vision loss through the medical model. And so we're looking at it as something is wrong with you, and this is something that needs to be fixed. Well, if you have a part of your identity that you think is wrong or needs to be fixed, of course, that's not going to be one that you're going to be like, hey, everyone, look at me, look at this piece of me. And so it really makes sense. And I think even just the larger conversation of why we even talk about this and why we're discussing it is because people have been in some ways told, oh, you can just go out there with your cane. You can just go out there with your tools. Who cares if people see you as blind? Why are you so embarrassed? Why are you ashamed of this? And so you end up thinking that it's a you problem. But as we release these episodes, we've gotten responses from people and emails from people of like, gosh, I thought that some of these things were in my head. Well, guess what? They're not in your head, and they're not in your head for a reason. There's reasons why you might want to protect pieces of your identity.
Definitely. I think that's been one of my favorite parts about becoming a mental health clinician and working with a variety of clients from all different backgrounds and all different intersectional identities who are adjusting to vision loss. It's fascinating to see that a lot of the limiting beliefs related to vision loss, a lot of the disempowering experiences happen across cultures, across socioeconomic statuses, across age range. It's really fascinating. And it helps me to recognize that it isn't just me or isn't just you. I mean, it used to be just you and I having these conversations or having them in small groups. And now that I'm hearing stories from different clients, I can hear that we all have so many similarities in our stories that cannot be coincidence.
That's such a good point. So when you're working with a client, I'm just curious who maybe is protecting that piece of their identity and they want to maybe explore telling their workplace or showing up in an educational setting at school or with their friends as someone with vision loss and they don't want to protect that part of their identity. What are some ways that you've been able to talk with them about dipping their toes in a bit?
That's a good question. It depends on the person and their circumstances, of course. But in general, I really start to explore safety. So how safe is it in an environment where you might want to share this part of your identity? Some people lose their jobs over this. I mean, that is a reality. And I'm not saying that as a scare technique to have people hide this part of their identity. It's real that that discrimination is real and prejudice is real. And so I try to really name that with people and explore where are the areas in your life where you do feel that you can share this part of your identity. And that might start in a friendship group. It might start with one coworker. It's like, where can we have kind of that access intimacy like we discussed in our second episode when we interviewed our husbands?
That's good advice. Do people find that easy to follow, hard to follow? Is there pieces of their identity they can work on like internally before they show it externally?
I mean, again, it just really depends on the person. I think there's just so many layers and complexity to all of it. That's why I find these discussions just so fascinating and why we wanted to bring this up on the podcast, because there's so much to unpack. So, Joy, I'm curious, in your life and as a professional and in your personal life, how do you see your identity as a person with a disability showing up for you right now in the present?
That's an interesting question because you would think that, gosh, we've been blogging for 14 years. We've now started this podcast. We've been doing the work, so to speak, going to those Daring Sisters retreats. I've been part of the National Federation of the Blind. I have a large supportive community of people with vision loss, and I feel proud of that part of my identity. And yet, why is it that I still question sometimes when to take out my cane or use certain techniques? Why do I still get embarrassed when people hear that my phone or computer is giving me the information in a meeting if I haven't muted myself? I mean, obviously part of that's if you're at a big meeting, you don't want your things being read aloud, but it's just interesting that I could be a director of a department, come as far as I have, and still wonder, gosh, at my next big presentation in front of 300 people, when I walk up to the front, should I have my cane, or will that be the only thing people are thinking of then? Even though a lot of my coworkers know about my disability, it's kind of still that fear of, it's not just the fear of people will think badly, but it's just sometimes the interactions of, oh, you're so inspirational, and just those things that I just don't want to have to deal with. I just want to be able to go on and do my job and go through my daily life without people commenting either way. I don't know. Is that too much to ask? Or why is that weird that I even care whether they're saying nice things or mean things? You know what I mean?
Yes. Well, I'm smiling, Joy, because I can just relate so much. I mean, just actually this week, I was having a lovely meeting with colleagues. We do a monthly consultation. And as we were leaving, we were descending a long flight of stairs, and I was navigating with my cane. And a colleague turned to me and said, "You're so amazing." And I said, "Oh, for walking down the stairs," and kind of like laughed because I wasn't sure what else to say. And she's just like, I mean, I just couldn't do it. I could not do it.
Mm.
And at that moment, I'm like, I am with other professionals and no one said anything. I don't know how many people heard, but I was really surprised and caught off guard. And so when we talk about wanting to protect a piece of our identity, here that part of my identity is out there. And I get this sense of pity or this sense of want to be you, which really doesn't feel good. And yet I think is reality. And so I laugh not to dismiss it or dismiss anything you're saying. I do think it's part of the experience of being human and especially of being disabled. And we spoke 2 months ago on grief. And I think for myself, it's still part of my grief journey when I am continuing to process those different interactions that occur in my life.
I'm also wondering, because you brought up that interaction, do you respond to that in the moment or do you address it at all? Or is it just something you kind of like brush off?
I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think it depends on the space that you're in and the person you are. I mean, there's so much talk around self advocacy and having difficult conversations or courageous conversations, and all of that is true. And when I'm in a space where I can have a conversation or I feel like someone is in a space where they can listen and it can be interactive about any topic, right? Whether it's my disability or politics or anything that feels kind of tense, I myself proceed cautiously because I try to really think through what I want to say, what I want to convey, and what the impact will be for other people and then also for myself.
That's a good point. And also knowing you, Jenelle, I feel like you are someone who's really careful about who you surround yourself with. So I know that if there's people who repeatedly just are addressing you as, oh, the person with a disability, and you can tell that's all they're thinking about, you tend to limit your interactions maybe with those people, and you surround yourself with people, from my observations, that are just very accepting, but also who are really matter of fact and don't really look at you as your disability, but they look at that as just a piece and they acknowledge it and they're helpful, but they're not people who overhelp or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a science to it. I feel like there's more of a vibe to it. I'm going to try to use language of the cool young generation. Like it's a vibe. I get a sense from someone if they're seeing my whole person, all my different identities, all the different characteristics that make me who I am. And if I feel a sense of belonging and acceptance from that individual, then I'm drawn to that connection and time with them. If I sense that othering, even if maybe it's something that's coming from myself, I'm going to take a step back and take a pause. I mean, it's a lot to unpack, and I don't want to get too overly thinking, we don't want to get into anxiety about it. And at the same time, I do think it's important to respond to the cues within ourselves.
Because there is the inner part of our identity and what we ourselves think and our relationship with our identity. And then there's the relationship with the outside world of our identity. And I think that's worth exploring both of those. And I love that you do that with your clients, that's the work a lot of times that you're doing, right? Is working on the self-identity and that relationship so that they can go out into the world and kind of navigate those conversations and interactions in ways that feel empowering to them.
Yeah, and that's the work that we're all doing as humans, whether it's in a therapy office or with a dear friend or a family member. We're all finding the places where we feel like we can no longer shield the parts of us that maybe we've experienced shame around or that haven't been fully accepted by either our early caregivers or our communities. And we're all learning and growing and trying to learn better ways of responding to each other.
Well said, Jenelle. We actually have a couple reflection questions that I'm going to ask that will help us to prepare for our next episode. And we don't really bring up these stories so that we can wallow in shame or sadness. We really bring them up so that we can do the work. This is the work, and it really does lead to freedom. we have an incredible leadership specialist who's going to be joining us to dig into the second part of identity and how we do move forward, even when we have pieces of our past and pieces of our story that we find painful. And so we can't address what's hidden. And so once we bring it into the light, that's when we can move forward. Once we grieve what needs to be grieved, grieve even the identities that maybe we're saying goodbye to, that's when we can move forward. And that's what our next guest is going to help us do. So a couple questions I'd like you to reflect on. What was a time you can remember where you learned to shrink or protect part of your identity based on someone else's response? And the second question is, when does that same vulnerable feeling still show up for you today?
I'm really excited about that conversation, Joy. But before we end, in case everyone has been so anxiously awaiting the end of our podcast, where we do a quick little game that we invite you to join in. So if you haven't listened before, this is a game where I will say a word. This time I'll be the game leader. And then I'll say 1, 2, 3, and we'll try to see if we have twin telepathy. Today I have cards to cue me from that lovely game. What is the game called?
It is called Blank Slate.
Blank Slate. Okay, so here we go. The first word is busy. 1, 2, 3.
Bee.
Mines. Mines and B. That was not twin telepathy. Okay. The second word is fire. 1, 2, 3.
Cracker.
Place. And one more try. We'll go with life. 1, 2, 3. Coach. Okay, no twin telepathy today, but maybe we matched with some of you listening. Thanks again for tuning into this conversation about identity.
We wish you a very restful and peaceful end of your year, and we will see you next year. Thank you for listening to Double Vision Podcast. If you found this valuable, we'd love for you to leave us a review on the podcast platform of your choice or subscribe on YouTube. We'd also love for you to keep in touch with us on social media, Facebook, Instagram. And if you have an idea for an episode or something that you'd like to process, please feel free to leave us a voice message at 949-414-8336. or send us an email at mail@doublevisionblog.com. All of this is also listed in the show notes.